May 25, 1945, 10:15 in the morning, the Pacific Ocean east of Okinawa. The sky was a bruised gray blue, heavy with humidity and unseen threats. A Yokosuka P-1Y Ginka bomber, sleek, twin-engined, and burdened with death, descended through patches of rain-laden clouds. Inside the narrow fuselage, 21-year-old Lieutenant Junior Grade Kaoru Hasegawa gripped the control yoke with whitened knuckles. Behind him, his two crew members sat in tense silence, their breath shallow, their minds fixed on a singular, absolute objective. The target was the American cruiser USS San Francisco. Success meant annihilation. Success meant honor. Success meant there would be no return. For 3 months, Hasegawa had carried this weight. Twice he had aborted kamikaze missions, his aircraft returning to Miho Air Base in Tottori Prefecture with the unbearable shame of failure clinging to him like smoke from a dying engine. His squadron mates had perished. His superiors had exchanged glances heavy with disappointment. The propaganda machine had drilled into him since childhood that Americans were demons, subhuman, sadistic, willing to torture prisoners to death. But something deeper gnawed at him. A soldier's instinct, a whisper of doubt that refused to be silenced, no matter how many hours he spent in indoctrination lectures, no matter how many patriotic songs filled the barracks. Yet today, he had sworn to himself, would be different. Today, he would complete the mission. Today, he would accept his destiny. This is the story of what happened when duty collided with mercy. When a young Japanese pilot, conditioned to believe death was preferable to capture, was pulled from the ocean by American sailors who treated him not as an enemy, but as a human being. It is the story of how a single act of compassion, repeated across a few hours, could shatter a lifetime of indoctrination and force a man to confront everything his nation had taught him to believe. It is a story about the extraordinary power of ordinary decency and about what becomes possible when former enemies choose forgiveness over revenge. The weight of propaganda. A nation raised on hate, Kaoru Hasegawa had never known peace. Born in Nagoya in 1924, he grew up in an imperial Japan that was preparing its young men for sacrifice. The militarization of Japanese society was not a sudden transformation, but a creeping inevitability, a slow poisoning of the well from which all ideals were drawn. By the time Hasegawa was old enough to understand the world, the mythology of Japanese superiority was already calcified into unquestionable truth. The state, the schools, the temples, the newspapers, all sang in unison about the divine nature of the emperor and the sacred duty to die in his service. The American enemy was rendered in the most grotesque terms. Propaganda films depicted Americans as crude, materialistic beings who valued money over honor, pleasure over discipline, individual gratification over collective good. Worse, and this was the kernel of the psychological conditioning, Americans were described as sadists who derived pleasure from torturing prisoners. Japanese military doctrine made it explicitly clear to be captured by the Americans was to enter a chamber of horrors. The choice between death and capture was not truly a choice. It was a mercy decision made in advance. Some Japanese soldiers, when facing the certainty of capture, chose suicide not as an act of nobility, but as an act of mercy toward themselves. The Kamikaze program, formalized in October 1944, took this ideology to its logical conclusion. With Japan's conventional air forces decimated by superior American pilots and aircraft, the military high command had transformed this catastrophe into a virtue. Suicide attacks became not a desperate measure, but a celebrated path to eternal glory. Young pilots, many with fewer than 100 hours of flight time, were told they would become kami, divine wind, striking down the invaders before they could soil the sacred soil of Japan. Death was rebranded as transcendence. The aircraft became a holy instrument. The pilot became a god. Hasegawa had received this training with the mixture of resignation and conviction that was expected of him. As a lieutenant junior grade, a promotion that came with the understanding that he would soon command his own squadron of doomed men, he absorbed the catechism. The Bushido Code, an idealized warrior philosophy that the military had excavated from history and polished into a weapon, taught that shame was worse than death. Loyalty was absolute. Refusal was unthinkable. His family's honor depended on his obedience. His nation's survival depended on his sacrifice. In the propaganda-saturated environment of 1945, with Japan's cities burning and defeat becoming visible on every horizon, a young man like Hasegawa could see only one honorable path forward. Yet even as he flew toward what he believed would be his last moment on Earth, a small voice within him, barely audible beneath the roar of the engines and the weight of expectation, questioned what he had been taught. This voice would prove to be more powerful than any indoctrination. The fatal mission, descent into fire. The morning of May 25 began like many others in the final suffocating months of the war. Hasegawa and his squadron of 12 Ginka bombers had been ordered to strike the American fleet east of Okinawa, where the invasion was entering its second month. The American naval presence was overwhelming. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers spread across the waters in a defensive umbrella so dense that penetrating it seemed like asking a man to walk through fire and emerge unburned. Yet the pilots were told this was possible. They were told they were invincible if they possessed the pure heart of sacrifice. The weather was the first enemy. Heavy rain and low cloud cover south of the Japanese mainland caused most of the squadron to turn back, their pilots reluctant to press on through the murk. But Hasegawa and the pilot beside him continued. The clouds parted. Below them, the gray expanse of ocean suddenly became populated with deadly machines, steel hulls bristling with guns, their fire control radar sweeping the skies. This was the moment all pilots feared and all pilots anticipated. At 10:15 in the morning, anti-aircraft gunners aboard the USS West Virginia spotted the two bombers emerging from the clouds. The battleship's guns swiveled and roared. One bomber caught fire almost immediately, beginning its death roll back into the sea. But Hasegawa's aircraft pressed on, diving toward the target, seeking the sweet spot where he could deliver his payload with maximum destructive force. His hands were steady on the controls. His mind was composed. He had trained for this moment 10,000 times, in his imagination, in the classroom, in the simulator. He had written letters to his family, folding them with careful deliberation, knowing these might be the last words his parents and sisters would ever read from his hand. Then another destroyer entered the calculus, the USS Callahan, a Fletcher-class destroyer with a crew of 320 men under the command of 32-year-old Commander Charles Mariner Bertholf, opened fire. Hasegawa felt the impact, a strike to the airframe that sent shudders through the fuselage like a physical blow. The instruments went dark. The engine screamed with a new, jagged note that signaled catastrophic damage. Smoke poured into the cockpit, thick and choking, carrying with it the smell of burning metal and oil. The aircraft was dying, and Hasegawa with it. He had mere seconds to process what was happening. The mission was failing. He was failing. The weight of that failure, not just for himself, but for his entire nation, his family's honor, the dead pilots of his squadron, crashed over him like a physical wave. And beneath it, something else, a cold recognition of mortality, the simplest and most profound of all human instincts. He did not want to die. The bomber fell toward the sea like a bird with shattered wings. Hasegawa felt consciousness fragmenting, the darkness rising up to meet him. His last coherent thought, suspended between terror and resignation, was that his nightmare of capture was about to become reality. If he survived this crash, the Americans would find him, and then the torture would begin. And then, finally, merciful death. The Pacific Ocean accepted the Ginka bomber like a hungry mouth, swallowing it whole. 2 of the 3 crew members were killed instantly or in the moments that followed. Kaoru Hasegawa, thrown clear in the violent deceleration, lost consciousness as he sank into the cold, crushing darkness. The decision, one captain's impossible choice. On the bridge of the USS Callahan, Commander Charles Mariner Bertholf stood in that liminal space between triumph and crisis. His gunners had shot down an enemy aircraft, That was victory. But victory in modern naval warfare came with complications that earlier generations of warriors never had to contemplate. Two men were in the water, enemy combatants who had just tried to kill him, his officers and his crew. They were 50 yards from his ship, clinging to debris or swimming weakly in the churning sea. Around him the Pacific was still alive with danger. The battle was not over. Other aircraft might emerge from the clouds at any moment. By every established protocol, every practical military calculation, and every vengeful instinct that war bred into the hearts of men, Bertholf should have ignored those drowning men. The official reasoning was unassailable. The ship and crew had to come first. Putting rescue boats into the water when the enemy might still strike would endanger more American lives. It would distract from defensive operations. It would waste resources and time. It was the kind of decision that courts-martial were made for if something went wrong. But something stirred in Bertholf, something that transcended military doctrine and the hardened protocols of warfare. He had graduated from Annapolis in 1934, and his 23 years of naval service had shown him that war, for all its mechanized brutality, was still conducted by human beings. Those human beings made choices, and those choices determined not just the outcome of battles, but the moral trajectory of a nation. To leave men to drown, even enemy men, was to surrender something essential. "Launch rescue boats," Bertholf commanded. Those 4 words violated every unwritten rule of modern naval combat. They transformed the USS Callahan for those few minutes from a war machine focused on destruction into something almost antique, a rescue vessel, a ship engaged in the business of saving life. The destruction unfolded with terrible efficiency. The rescue boat was launched. American sailors, no more sophisticated in their understanding of war than the pilots they were rescuing, went over the side. Among them was Leo Jarboe, an 18-year-old gunner who had served as a swimming instructor before the war. Jarboe had no moral calculation to make. His job was to save lives in the water, and this moment simply extended what he already did. Hasegawa was pulled from the water, unconscious, severely injured, with the ocean still draining from his lungs. The man who had tried to kill them was now in their hands, alive, but hanging by a thread. The impossible mercy, rescue and revelation. Consciousness returned to Kaoru Hasegawa like the surfacing of a drowning man, fragmentary and confused. He lay on the deck of the USS Callahan, his body racked with pain. His right side was a landscape of burns. Cuts covered his skin. Internal injuries had left him coughing blood. Every breath was an agony. But underneath the physical pain was something more overwhelming, the psychological terror of what came next. He expected bullets. He expected bayonets. He expected the Americans to take revenge for his attempt to murder them. The propaganda had been explicit on this point. Captured pilots were not prisoners. They were leverage for cruelty, entertainment for sadists who had none of the warrior's code that supposedly governed Japanese soldiers. His mind, fogged by pain and shock, struggled to process the fact that he was still alive. And then something happened that could not be processed through any framework he had ever been given. A young sailor no older than Hasegawa himself appeared at his side. The American held out a cup of water. His face showed no sign of malice, no hunger for revenge. He was simply offering water to a man who was thirsty. The gesture was so ordinary, so profoundly humane, that it shattered something in Hasegawa's understanding of the world. He would later say that this moment, a cup of water offered by a stranger who had every reason to hate him, was the moment his world ended and another began. The cup was not just water. It was a refutation of everything the propaganda had taught him. It was proof that the Americans were not demons. It was evidence that his superiors, the military structure he had never questioned, might have lied to him about fundamental things. It was a single drop of human kindness in an ocean of indoctrination. The crew of the USS Callahan treated the Japanese pilot's wounds. Ship's Dr. Parker examined him with professional care, noting the burns, the lacerations, the probable internal injuries. The sailor assigned to guard Hasegawa, and he was being guarded, though the guard seemed more concerned with the prisoner's welfare than with his imprisonment, shared his rations. The American sailors offered cigarettes. They spoke to him as though he were a person, not a piece of refuse to be disposed of. The second kamikaze pilot, Hasegawa's crewmate, died from his injuries, so the only testimony to what had happened in the sky, to the mission's intent, came from Hasegawa himself, who was now dependent on the mercy of the men he had tried to kill. The irony was not lost on him. In a just war, or in the imagination of those who still believed such a thing existed, the prisoner should have been racked with guilt, his conscience a torment worse than any physical pain. But Hasegawa felt something more complex. Gratitude mixed with confusion, mixed with the slow, agonizing realization that his entire worldview had been built on lies. 3 days after being fished from the ocean, Hasegawa was transferred by stretcher to the battleship USS New Mexico, where he remained as a prisoner of war. The transfer was another shock, another moment of disorientation. He was being treated like a patient, not like an enemy. The medical staff aboard the battleship continued his treatment with the same professionalism the Callahan's doctor had shown. But the breaking of the old world was not yet complete. Hasegawa, who had been taught that capture was a fate worse than death, who had been told that the only honorable course for a soldier who found himself a prisoner was to take his own life, arrived at what he believed was the logical conclusion of his new circumstances. While under guard, with access to the means of self-destruction that seemed to present themselves in the cramped quarters of the battleship, he attempted suicide. The American guard raised the alarm. The medical team saved his life for the second time in 4 days. They responded to the attempted suicide not with contempt or punishment, but with intensive medical care. They kept him alive, against his will, against his wishes, against every teaching he had internalized about what it meant to be a prisoner of war. This act of mercy, and it could be called nothing else, broke something final in Hasegawa's resistance. He had expected torture. Instead, he received treatment. He had expected to be dehumanized. Instead, Americans treated him as though his life, his continued existence, had absolute value. This was revolutionary. In the military culture Hasegawa had known his entire life, individual life was expendable, fungible, a resource to be spent in service of larger purposes. American military personnel, by their actions, embodied a completely different philosophy, that human life possessed intrinsic worth that could not be overridden by military necessity or the demands of the state. The slow work of transformation had begun. Not because anyone was trying to change Hasegawa, but because he was being given evidence, concrete, overwhelming, undeniable, that contradicted what he had been taught. The reckoning. A nation's lies confronted Hasegawa spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war, first on Guam and then in Hawaii, at the Honolulu Gulch internment camp on the island of Oahu. The war's end in August 1945 came with a strange mixture of relief and dislocation. Japan had surrendered. The emperor, far from being invincible, had proven as mortal and fallible as any other leader. The propagandistic architecture that had organized Japanese society had collapsed like a house built on sand. But for Hasegawa, something more personal was occurring. The months in captivity had allowed him to observe the American military personnel, the Hawaiian landscape, the democratic rituals of American life with increasing clarity. He was learning English. He was talking to guards who had no reason to deceive him. He was forming friendships that transcended the boundaries of national enmity. Most importantly, he was discovering that the Americans the propagandists had described, the barbarous, sadistic monsters willing to torture for amusement, simply did not exist. The Americans he encountered were individuals, men with families, with concerns, with moral codes that valued human dignity. When repatriation came, Hasegawa returned to Japan a fundamentally changed person. The nation he returned to was also transformed, defeated, occupied, forced to confront the catastrophic consequences of its militaristic ideology. For many Japanese, including Hasegawa, the encounter with the American occupiers demonstrated something stunning. The American military, which had every justification for harsh treatment, instead instituted programs of reconstruction, democratization, and economic assistance. The Americans were acting not as conquerors extracting vengeance, but as mentors guiding Japan toward a different future. Hasegawa's journey from warrior to businessman was not instantaneous, but it was inevitable. He had been saved from death twice, once by American guns that brought him down before his intended target, and once by American medical care that refused to let him die. These facts were not abstractions for him. They were formative experiences that had reshaped his soul. He had learned through the most visceral of all methods that the nation he had been prepared to die for had lied to him about fundamental matters, that Americans whom he had been conditioned to hate possessed moral resources that the Japanese state had systematically tried to suppress in its own population. The long arc. From enemy to ally. The post-war years saw Hasegawa build a new life in a new Japan. He entered business, eventually becoming president of the Rengo Company Limited, an international corrugated packaging manufacturer that would grow to employ more than 4,000 people. By any measure, he had achieved extraordinary success. He had become exactly what Japan's militaristic regime claimed to be fighting for, a prosperous businessman serving a healthy economy. But the regime's methods would have made that prosperity impossible. In the 1990s, now in his 70s, Hasegawa made a decision that spoke volumes about how completely his encounter with American mercy had transformed him. He undertook extensive research into the historical records of his rescue. He went through naval archives, military documents, and personal accounts until he had identified the men of the USS Callahan, the destroyer that shot down his aircraft and pulled him from the sea. He then reached out to the survivors, made contact with the reunion organization they had established, and requested permission to attend. In July 1995, 50 years to the month after his rescue, Hasegawa stood before the surviving crew of the USS Callahan at a reunion in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. He was greeted not as an enemy or even as a curious historical figure, but as a survivor of the ship. In an extraordinary gesture of reconciliation, the crew treated him as one of their own, a man who had been aboard the Callahan, if only for those crucial hours, and who carried in his body and his soul the mark of their mercy. "The enemy yesterday can be your friend today," Hasegawa told them, his words carefully chosen, his English accented but fluent, his emotion barely controlled. He had brought gifts. He had brought stories. He had brought evidence that their act of compassion, performed in the heat of battle with no guarantee of recognition or reward, had borne fruit across 5 decades. Among the men he encountered was Leo Jarbo, the 18-year-old swimmer who had pulled him from the water 50 years earlier. Jarbo was now an old man, but when Hasegawa thanked him, personally directly, with tears in his eyes, the power of that gratitude seemed to collapse the years between them. They embraced. 2 men who should have been enemies had become brothers. The captain who ordered the rescue, Commander Charles Mariner Bertholf, had already passed away in 1991, but his legacy lived on in the gratitude of the men he had commanded to save a life when every calculation of war suggested otherwise. In the years that followed, Hasegawa deepened his commitment to honoring those who had saved him. He visited the USS Callahan reunions annually, donating funds in honor of the ship and its fallen crew. When the Callahan was later sunk in July 1945, struck by another kamikaze plane, losing 47 of her crew, Hasegawa grieved as though it had happened to his own family. In a very real sense, it had. The ship that had saved him had ultimately made the sacrifice he had tried to make, and the men who would have treated any survivor the same way he had been treated. In 2000, as a capstone to this extraordinary reconciliation, Hasegawa paid for a 10-day journey to Japan for Leo Jarbo, Jake Highmark, and Buzz Bazzetti, the 2 surviving executive officers of the Callahan, and the man who had retrieved Hasegawa's aviation watch on the day of rescue. Bazzetti had held onto that watch for more than 50 years, a small artifact connecting past and present, enemy and friend. Hasegawa wanted them to see Japan not as a conquered enemy nation, not through the lens of militaristic propaganda, but as it truly was, a culture, a civilization, a people capable of beauty and mercy, just as Americans were. The architecture of transformation, how one act of mercy changed everything. What is remarkable about Hasegawa's story is not its uniqueness, but its ordinariness. It demonstrates something fundamental about human nature, that we are not fixed at birth in our capacity for hatred or our capacity for compassion. We are shaped by what we are taught and shown. Hasegawa had been taught to hate, but he had been shown mercy. And shown mercy is what changed him. The psychological research on attitude change and cognitive dissonance confirms what happened to Hasegawa at a neurological level. When a person encounters evidence that directly contradicts their deeply held beliefs, particularly evidence that comes in the form of concrete experience rather than abstract argument, a state of profound psychological tension emerges. That tension cannot be resolved by maintaining the old beliefs if the evidence is overwhelming. Hasegawa was offered water by someone he had been conditioned to see as a demon. That cup of water was not just a drink. It was empirical evidence that everything he had been told about Americans was false. But Hasegawa's story also reveals something deeper about military culture and the nature of command authority. Commander Bertholf made a choice that, while ultimately vindicated by history, was in the moment a genuinely risky decision. He had every rational excuse to ignore those drowning men. He had every precedent to justify abandoning them. But he chose differently. He chose to act as though the enemy's life had value. In doing so, he created a situation where transformation became possible. The men of the USS Callahan did not set out to change Hasegawa's worldview. They were not engaged in some sophisticated psychological operation designed to break down his conditioning. They were simply treating a wounded enemy with the care any medical professional would extend, with the professionalism any guard would provide, with the basic human decency that war had not yet extinguished from their hearts. And because they did this, a mind that had been sealed shut by propaganda, fear, and the weight of cultural expectation was gradually opened up. The cup of water offered by young Leo Jarboe to a man who had tried to kill him was an act of profound moral courage. Jarboe was not thinking strategically. He was not calculating the historical significance of his gesture. He was simply seeing another human being in distress and responding to that need. In the architecture of transformation, such moments are foundational. They occur before thought, before rationalization, before the mind has time to erect the barriers of tribal identity and military obligation. 50 years later, when Hasegawa returned to meet his rescuers, the moral circle had completed. A man who had been conditioned to kill Americans in service of what he was told was a sacred cause, had instead been saved by Americans who acted according to principles he had never encountered in his own military culture. That saving had cost them nothing militarily. The Callahan continued to function as a destroyer. But it had cost them something morally to extend that mercy, because mercy in the context of war requires the subordination of revenge instinct, the denial of the satisfying knowledge that an enemy has been punished for his crimes. The historical reckoning. What happened to everyone? The USS Callahan, the destroyer that pulled Hasegawa from the water and refused to let him die, did not long survive her moment of mercy. On July 28, 1945, 2 months and 3 days after rescuing the Kamikaze pilot, she was stationed at Radar Picket Station No. 9, west of Karama-Redo, near Okinawa. Commander Bertholf had maneuvered her through dozens of air attacks over the preceding months, balancing the need to maintain her defensive position with the need to keep his crew alive. The war was winding down. Victory was coming. A handful of months separated them from the peace they could already taste. At 12:20 in the morning on July 29, the radar detected aircraft approaching. General quarters sounded. The crew scrambled to their battle stations, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this dozens of times. They were tired but ready. They had survived everything the Japanese had thrown at them. They had one hand on the doorknob of history, about to walk into a world at peace. At 12:40 a.m., a biplane with floats, a Yokosuka K-5Y trainer that the Japanese had converted into a makeshift kamikaze, descended through the darkness. The proximity fuses that were designed to detonate shells near wooden aircraft malfunctioned. The plane skimmed low, undetected, and crashed directly into the Callahan's starboard side. The bomb it carried penetrated the after-engine room. The ship began to flood. The fires ignited the anti-aircraft ammunition, which exploded with catastrophic force. The entire after section of the ship was transformed into an inferno. Commander Bertholf, standing on the bridge, made his second crucial decision of the war. He ordered the crew, except for a small salvage party, to abandon ship. The last man to leave was Bertholf himself. He went down with the Callahan not as a martyr, but as a captain, ensuring his men had reached safety. The destroyer, which had saved a kamikaze pilot's life 50 years before, now became the last Allied ship sunk by kamikaze attack. 47 of her crew perished in the waters where Hasegawa had been rescued months earlier. Leo Jarbo, the young sailor who had pulled Hasegawa from the water, survived the sinking. He spent 6 hours in the water after abandoning ship, drawing on his swimming training to stay alive. When rescued, he carried with him the memory of the mercy he had shown to an enemy, a memory that would define the rest of his life. Jarbo attended virtually every Callahan reunion from 1972 onward, and he lived to be an old man, long enough to reunite with the pilot he had saved. Kaoru Hasegawa lived to be 81 years old, dying in his native Japan in 2005. By that time, he had spent more than 50 years atoning for the death mission he had been ordered to undertake, not through self-flagellation or guilt, but through acts of gratitude and reconciliation. He had transformed his own experience of salvation into a mission to ensure that others understood the power of mercy. His business success was not meaningless achievement from a man at peace with his past. It was the flowering of a life that had been given back to him, that he lived not just for himself, but in honor of those who had chosen to save him. Commander Bertholf was advanced to the rank of captain and served for many years more in the Navy, retiring in 1965 after 35 years of service. He went on to work for the Central Intelligence Agency, eventually serving as chief of the Operational Center for 7 years. He died in 1991 at the age of 78, long enough to know that his decision in May 1945 to order a rescue had borne fruit in the decades that followed. His legacy was not just military service, it was the demonstration that in the midst of war, conscience and compassion could still be choices available to men in command. The metaphysical lesson, why this story matters. The story of Kaoru Hasegawa and the USS Callahan is not simply a feel-good narrative of war ending and enemies becoming friends, though it is that. It is a profound meditation on the nature of human nature itself, on whether identity, national, military, ideological, is fixed or contingent. The Japanese military establishment had spent Hasegawa's entire lifetime trying to convince him that he had a fixed identity. He was a warrior, he was Japanese, he was bound by honor codes that admitted of no alternative. The propaganda machinery had constructed his reality, telling him what to believe, what to value, what to fear, and what to hate. One cup of water had proven it all to be contingent, revisable, optional. Not because someone had argued him out of it, but because his senses, his direct experience, his confrontation with the alternative had shown him something different. The Americans he encountered were not demons. The mercy they extended was not cruelty masquerading as kindness. The value they placed on his life was not a trap or a deception. It was genuine and consistent, and demonstrated across multiple instances and multiple people. What happened to Hasegawa can happen to any person raised in any ideology, subjected to any propaganda, conditioned by any authority structure. We are not prisoners of our origins. We are not locked into the identities that others have constructed for us. Encounter with genuine otherness, with people who violate our expectations by being fundamentally more humane than we have been conditioned to expect, creates the possibility of transformation. This is not a comfortable lesson for those who benefit from ideological conditioning. It suggests that the beliefs we hold, the hatreds we harbor, the certainties we carry, all of these are subject to revision through evidence. But Hasegawa's story also contains a warning. The transformation of one man, extraordinary though it is, does not change the historical fact that tens of thousands of other kamikaze pilots did not survive to be rescued, did not encounter American mercy, did not have the opportunity to revise their understanding of the world. The USS Callahan's order to rescue that drowning pilot was, in the context of the war, a relatively small thing. It did not materially affect the outcome of the Pacific War, but in the context of one individual's soul, it was everything. It was the difference between a man dying in hatred and confusion and a man living to become a testament to the possibility of redemption. The enduring question, what might have been? In the architecture of human affairs, there exists a question that can only be asked counterfactually. What would have become of Kaoru Hasegawa if Leo Jarbo had not been a kind man? If Commander Bertholf had made the rational choice to ignore the drowning pilot? If the crew of the USS Callahan had treated him as an enemy rather than as a human being in need of aid, almost certainly Hasegawa would have perished in the Pacific. The second pilot died. The third crew member may have also been killed. Hasegawa might have drowned, might have been attacked by sharks, might have succumbed to his injuries in the cold water. If he survived the ocean, the Japanese military system might have court-martialed him for returning without completing his mission. Failing to die in combat while trying to achieve a major objective would have been considered a profound dereliction of duty. The shame would have been unbearable. Alternatively, Hasegawa lived. He lived because American sailors, trained in a culture that believed human life had value even when that human was an enemy, chose to act according to that belief. Because of that choice, a man who had been formed by propaganda and militarism lived to become something else, a successful businessman, a peacemaker, a testament to the possibility that old enemies can become genuine friends. The Rengo Company employed 4,000 people in Hasegawa's lifetime. Thousands more were employed by companies supplied by Rengo's products. Generations of children, grandchildren, nephews, and nieces of Hasegawa's friends and business associates would be born and educated. The economic activity flowing from the existence of one man, extended forward across decades, is immeasurable. And beyond the economic calculation, there is the moral reality. A man lived who might have died. A consciousness that might have been extinguished instead matured into wisdom. A voice that might have been silenced instead spoke across 50 years about reconciliation and the possibility of transformation. These are not quantifiable things, but they are real. The echo, what remains today, more than 80 years after that May morning in 1945, the USS Callahan no longer floats in the Pacific. The ship rests on the bottom, its hull encrusted with coral and inhabited by fish, its instruments long since corroded into undifferentiated metal. But the ship's memory lives on, preserved in the testimonies of the men who served aboard her, in the documents and photographs maintained by naval historians, and most powerfully in the life of Kaoru Hasegawa, a kamikaze pilot who lived to tell the story of the mercy that was shown to him. In recent decades, as historians have grappled with the moral complexities of World War II, they have come to understand that the war was not simply good versus evil, light versus darkness. It was human beings grappling with impossible choices, conditioned by cultures and ideologies beyond their individual control, yet still possessing the capacity, fragile but real, to choose compassion in moments of crisis. The USS Callahan's crew was not composed of saints. They were ordinary sailors, many of whom had lost friends to Japanese attacks, many of whom feared and hated the enemy they were fighting. Yet when the moment came to show mercy, many of them chose to do so. Kaoru Hasegawa's story is ultimately not a tale of American moral superiority or Japanese depravity. It is a story about the fundamental human capacity for moral choice, a capacity that exists across cultures and ideologies. It is about what becomes possible when someone, a captain, a sailor, a medical officer, chooses to extend the circle of moral consideration to include those defined as enemies. The cup of water was not a grand gesture. It was not filmed or photographed or reported in the newspapers. It was a small, private act of kindness performed by a young man who had no idea it would be remembered for the rest of his life. But therein lies the transformative power. Small acts of mercy, multiplied across time and circumstance, can reshape not just individuals, but relationships between entire nations. Hasegawa's recovery was not just physical, it was spiritual and moral and psychological. He was recovered from propaganda, from hatred, from the belief that his own death was inevitable and honorable. He was recovered into a different understanding of what it meant to be human, what it meant to live in a community, what it meant to extend forgiveness to those who had tried to kill you. The USS Callahan crew demonstrated an understanding that would take Japan and the world decades to learn, that the future belonged not to those who perfected the technologies of destruction, but to those who could transcend the cycles of revenge and hatred. That understanding, embodied in small acts of mercy, proved more powerful than any military weapon. It reshaped the post-war world. It transformed an enemy into a friend. It gave a man his life back. 50 years later, when Kaoru Hasegawa stood before the survivors of the USS Callahan and said, "The enemy yesterday can be your friend today," he was not simply making a sentimental statement. He was testifying to what had been made possible by mercy, by the refusal to accept the logic of dehumanization, by the choice made by a captain and his crew in the heat of battle to treat an enemy as a human being worthy of care. That testimony echoes still across the decades, a reminder that transformation is possible, that mercy is efficacious, and that the most powerful weapon any human being possesses is the capacity to choose compassion when every circumstance suggests otherwise.